Concern should drive us into action and not into a depression. No man is free who cannot control himself. Pythagoras. Silence is better than unmeaning words. Do not say a little in many words but a great deal in a few. Pythagoras. There is geometry in the humming of the strings, there is music in the spacing of the spheres. Pythagoras. The oldest, shortest words, yes and no, are those which require the most thought. Anger begins with folly, and ends with repentance. As soon as laws are necessary for men, they are no longer fit for freedom. Pythagoras. There is a good principle which created order, light, and man, and an evil principle which created chaos, darkness, and woman. Pythagoras. Above the cloud with its shadow is the star with its light. Above all things reverence thyself. Friends are as companions on a journey, who want to aid each other to persevere in the road to a happier life. Pythagoras. The most momentous thing in human life is the art of winning the soul to good or evil. Pythagoras. It is better whether to be silent, or to say things of more value than silence. Sooner throw a pearl at hazard than an idle or useless word, and do not say a little in many words, but a great deal in a few. Pythagoras. Rest satisfied with doing well, and leave others to talk of you as they will. Choose rather to be strong of soul than strong of body. There is nothing so easy but that it becomes difficult when you do it reluctantly. Pythagoras. As long as man continues to be the ruthless destroyer of lower living beings, he will never know health or peace. For as long as men massacre animals, they will kill each other. Pythagoras. Above all things, reverence yourself. Beings have a soul. A thought is an idea in transit. Strength of mind rests in sobriety, for this keeps your reason unclouded by passion. Virtue is harmony. Do not talk a little on many subjects, but much on a few. Reason is immortal, all else mortal. No one is free who has not obtained the empire of himself. Begin thus from the first act, and proceed, and, in conclusion, at the ill which thou hast done, be troubled, and rejoice for the good. Pythagoras. Pythagoras, one of the most famous and controversial ancient Greek philosophers, lived from ca. 570 to ca. 490 BCE. He spent his early years on the island of Samos, off the coast of modern Turkey. At the age of 40, however, he emigrated to the city of Croton in southern Italy, and most of his philosophical activity occurred there. Pythagoras wrote nothing, nor were there any detailed accounts of his thought written by contemporaries. By the 1st centuries BCE, moreover, it became fashionable to present Pythagoras in a largely unhistorical fashion as a semi-divine figure, who originated all that was true in the Greek philosophical tradition, including many of Plato's and Aristotle's mature ideas. A number of treatises were forged in the name of Pythagoras and other Pythagoreans in order to support this view. The Pythagorean question, then, is how to get behind this false glorification of Pythagoras in order to determine what the historical Pythagoras actually thought and did. In order to obtain an accurate appreciation of Pythagoras' achievement, it is important to rely on the earliest evidence before the distortions of the later tradition arose. The popular modern image of Pythagoras is that of a master mathematician and scientist. The early evidence shows, however, that, while Pythagoras was famous in his own day and even 150 years later in the time of Plato and Aristotle, it was not mathematics or science upon which his fame rested. Pythagoras was famous, 1. As an expert on the fate of the soul after death, who thought that the soul was immortal and went through a series of reincarnations. 2. As an expert on religious ritual. 3. As a wonder worker who had a thigh of gold and who could be two places at the same time. 4. As the founder of a strict way of life that emphasized dietary restrictions, religious ritual and rigorous self-discipline. It remains controversial whether he also engaged in the rational cosmology that is typical of the pre-Socratic philosopher/scientists and whether he was in any sense a mathematician. The early evidence suggests, however, that Pythagoras presented a cosmos that was structured according to moral principles and significant numerical relationships and may have been akin to conceptions of the cosmos found in Platonic myths, such as those at the end of the Phaedo and Republic. In such a cosmos, the planets were seen as instruments of divine vengeance. The hounds of Persephone, the sun and moon are the isles of the blessed where we may go, if we live a good life, while thunder functioned to frighten the souls being punished in Tartarus. The heavenly bodies also appear to have moved in accordance with the mathematical ratios that govern the concordant musical intervals in order to produce a music of the heavens, which in a later tradition developed into the harmony of the spheres. It is doubtful that Pythagoras himself thought in terms of spheres, and the mathematics of the movements of the heavens was not worked out in detail. There is evidence that he valued relationships between numbers such as those embodied in the so-called Pythagorean theorem, though it is not likely that he proved the theorem. In recent scholarship, this consensus view has received strong challenges, which will be discussed below. Pythagoras' cosmos was developed in a more scientific and mathematical direction by his successors in the Pythagorean tradition, Philolaus and Archytas. Pythagoras succeeded in promulgating a new, more optimistic view of the fate of the soul after death and in founding a way of life that was attractive for its rigor and discipline and that drew to him numerous devoted followers. What were the beliefs and practices of the historical Pythagoras? This apparently simple question has become the daunting Pythagorean question for several reasons. First, Pythagoras himself wrote nothing, so our knowledge of Pythagoras' views is entirely derived from the reports of others. Second, there was no extensive or authoritative contemporary account of Pythagoras. No one did for Pythagoras what Plato and Xenophon did for Socrates. Third, only fragments of the first detailed accounts of Pythagoras, written about 150 years after his death, have survived. Fourth, it is clear that these accounts disagreed with one another on significant points. These 4 points would already make the problem of determining Pythagoras' philosophical beliefs more difficult than determining those of almost any other ancient philosopher, but a fifth factor complicates matters even more. By the 3rd century CE, when the first detailed accounts of Pythagoras that survive intact were written, Pythagoras had come to be regarded, in some circles, as the master philosopher, from whom all that was true in the Greek philosophical tradition derived. By the end of the 1st century BCE, a large collection of books had been forged in the name of Pythagoras and other early Pythagoreans, which purported to be the original Pythagorean texts from which Plato and Aristotle derived their most important ideas. A treatise forged in the name of Timaeus of Locri was the supposed model for Plato's Timaeus, just as forged treatises assigned to Archytas were the supposed model for Aristotle's Categories. Pythagoras himself was widely presented as having anticipated Plato's later metaphysics, in which the one and the indefinite dyad are first principles. Thus, not only is the earliest evidence for Pythagoras' views meager and contradictory, it is overshadowed by the hagiographical presentation of Pythagoras, which became dominant in late antiquity. Given these circumstances, the only reliable approach to answering the Pythagorean question is to start with the earliest evidence, which is independent of the later attempts to glorify Pythagoras, and to use the picture of Pythagoras which emerges from this early evidence as the standard against which to evaluate what can be accepted and what must be rejected in the later tradition. Following such an approach, Walter Burkert, in his epoch-making book, 1972a, revolutionized our understanding of the Pythagorean question, and all modern scholarship on Pythagoras, including this article, stands on his shoulders. For a detailed discussion of the source problems that generate the Pythagorean question, see 2. Sources, below. Pythagoras was born in 570 BC on the Greek island of Samos, and thus he was also referred to as Pythagoras of Samos. He spent most of his early life on the island of Samos itself and then moved to the city of Croton at the age of 40. It is said that Pythagoras belonged to a family of a wealthy gem merchant. Pythagoras took an active interest in different fields of study. He took a keen interest in the field of mathematics, religion, mysticism, ethics, metaphysics, politics, and music theory. He has a major impact on the religious and political teachings of the Magna Graecia. An interesting fact about the discoveries and thoughts of Pythagoras is that there is no written evidence found about his contributions. But even then, he has been mentioned in the texts and philosophies of several other thinkers. The Pythagoras theorem is one of the most popular and commonly known discoveries credited to Pythagoras. The theorem provides a relationship between the hypotenuse, height, and perpendicular of a triangle. The relevance of this relationship is so significant that it is still one of the most commonly used mathematical relations after more than 2,200 years after its discovery. Nowadays, Pythagoras has an image of a reputed thinker and mathematician, but during his time, the scientific abilities of Pythagoras were not the only qualities that made him popular. Pythagoras had several philosophical ideas associated with him, and thus he created the idea of Pythagoreans. Death of Pythagoras. Just like his birth and life, exact written records about the death of Pythagoras have not been found. Different historians have given different theories and stories about the death of Pythagoras. The most reliable description of his death is found in the records of Aristoxenus and Dicaearchus. According to them, after living for some time in the city of Croton, Pythagoras and his followers were forced to leave the city due to their exclusive nature of the lifestyle. Then, he fled to the city of Metapontum, where he died around 490 BC.